Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts give new resurrection life to us, your people, O God. Amen. We all love a story with an unlikely hero. A story with a character who we thought was unimportant or even bad, but somehow, some way, that character turns out to be essential to the happy ending in a story. So, for my fellow Harry Potter fans, I'm not going to ruin anything if you're not, if you haven't encountered it yet, but think of Neville, we'll just say, or think of Professor Snape. Or for my fellow Home Alone 2 fans, anyone? Maybe not. Okay, a few. Think of the woman with the bird seed, right? Think of the old woman who Kevin meets in the park. Initially, he's terrified of her, but then it turns out, thanks to her bird seed in the end, she is crucial to saving the day. Our Easter story this morning features an unlikely hero in Mary Magdalene. She is the first one to see the risen Jesus. She is the first one to share the good news of resurrection. Really, in a sense, she's the one who gets this whole Christian thing off the ground. And yet, in all four of the Gospels, she is hardly mentioned up until the crucifixion of Jesus. All we know about her from what comes before in this story is that she's a committed follower, a committed student of Jesus, along with numerous other women. It seems also that she has helped financially support Jesus' ministry. But we don't know anything else about her except one thing. We know that there's a story going around about this Mary. Word has it that before she met Jesus, she was possessed. Apparently, she had gone through some serious mental and emotional distress. And everyone who knew her knew about it. Who knows what they thought about her or how they treated her as a result? I'm guessing something like how Kevin treated that old woman in Home Alone 2. And this is the person who Jesus chooses to appear to. Not to any of the 12 apostles, the main characters in our gospel stories, but to a lesser-known follower who has been devalued because of her sex, stigmatized because of her illness. Jesus chooses her to be the first preacher of resurrection. An unlikely hero indeed. So my question for us this morning is, what does it take for her to become this hero? What does it take for Mary to see Jesus, to become the first preacher of resurrection? You might have noticed either when it was being narrated the first time or being read the second time, it doesn't happen right away. There's a story here. There's a process of recognition. There are a few steps in the journey for Mary Magdalene. And this morning, I want to focus on just one step in that journey, just one thing that it takes for Mary to see Jesus, and one thing that it takes for us to see Jesus in our own way today. But first, let's take a few steps back in the story. 10 or so verses before this morning's passage, Mary comes to Jesus' tomb alone. It's still dark outside. And as she gets close to the tomb, she realizes that the stone in front of it has been moved away. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that Mary felt like I would have felt, which is freaked out of my mind. And she does, in fact, do what I would have done, which is run away. She runs to find Peter and John, two of Jesus' closest disciples, and tells them that someone has stolen the body. They all run back to the tomb together, and then Peter and John, just pulsing with exhilaration, rush in. They see the grave clothes there. The text tells us, weirdly, that the linens are folded up, so I guess the risen Jesus is a bit of a neat freak. I don't know. Regardless, besides the weird thing with the linens, there's nothing to see. No body, nothing happening, just an empty tomb. Peter and John don't understand it. The exhilaration subsides. They start to twiddle their thumbs, and then they go back home. They leave. And that's where our passage this morning begins. Mary Magdalene does not leave. She stands weeping outside the tomb. Because nothing was happening right then and there, I guess Peter and John just moved along, but Mary sticks around. She shows patience and persistence at the tomb. She senses that something is happening here, that God is doing something here, and so she stays. She waits. She sits with her grief. And not only that, the text tells us that after Peter and John have fled the scene, Mary goes back into the tomb. She actually steps toward the source of her grief, trusting that this is the next step to take on her journey. Most of us, I imagine, don't like hanging around creepy tombs, except maybe on Halloween. Most of us also don't like to get too close to our fear, our grief, our anger. It's much easier to push that stuff down, to pretend like it's not a big deal, to just let it be and keep on moving. It's much easier to run away from the tombs in our lives than to wait and see what life might come out of them. But in order for Mary to see Jesus this Easter morning, she's got to go toward, not away from, her grief and fear. She's got to sit with the horror of what has transpired over the past few days. She's got to sit with the fact that the light of God that burned in Jesus was brutally snuffed out. She can't run away from that darkness because otherwise she'll miss God's light breaking in. She'll miss God breathing new life into that which is dead. And we too, friends, if we want to see Jesus in the tombs of our own lives, we can't run away from the darknesses. We've got to be open to finding Jesus in those tombs. Jesus is no stranger to grief or fear or anger or death. Jesus invites us to take a step toward finding him there. Now, when Jesus does show up in the story, when the presence of God breaks in this story and in the stories of our own lives, we don't always recognize it right away, do we? In fact, this is a theme throughout the stories of the Bible. Angels are always popping up, and people are always mistaking them for men. In the very first book of Genesis, 3 angels appear to Abraham and Sarah, announce the birth of their son Isaac, and at first Abraham and Sarah think they are travelers passing by. In our story today, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, and at first she thinks he is the gardener. Mary Magdalene had been following Jesus for 3 years. Apparently, even those of us who think we know Jesus pretty well, who've been following him for quite some time, even we can still miss him sometimes. Even we can still misrecognize his presence in our midst. For Mary, the moment of clarity, the moment of recognition, the beginning of this story's happy ending, is simply when Jesus says to her, Mary. When Jesus speaks her name, everything clicks. She immediately recognizes Jesus, rushes to him, and embraces him. It's a beautiful, tender moment, and it's got me thinking. What does it mean for Jesus to call your name? Many of us are used to thinking of God addressing the church, the world. What does it mean for God to address you? What does it mean for God to address you specifically? Are we ready for that? How do we feel about that? At the end of our story, Jesus actually tells Mary, "Stop embracing me." In other words, don't get used to this. You won't have me in the flesh forever because I am going back to God. And he does. But of course, that is not the end of the story of Jesus. Because Jesus' own Spirit, the Spirit of God, comes to us and dwells in us, moves and acts in our midst today as the Spirit of Jesus moved and acted 2,000 years ago. And we are invited, friends, to be on the lookout for the Spirit, to be on the lookout for new life breaking out of this world's many, many, many tombs. May our hearts and minds become more and more open to noticing and celebrating God's ongoing work of resurrection. Amen.